Welcome to the Bare Metal Cyber CRISC Prepcast. This series helps you prepare for the exam with focused explanations and practical content. Domain 4 is where risk management aligns directly with IT operations and information security. In other words, this is where risk strategy becomes technology strategy. This domain ensures that IT practices and security capabilities support treatment plans, business continuity, and recovery efforts. In other words, it makes sure IT supports resilience. It focuses on resilience, architecture, incident management, disaster recovery, and the secure design of systems. In other words, the domain connects infrastructure and continuity. On the CRISC exam, Domain 4 often presents scenarios where technical actions affect business outcomes, or where risk professionals must engage with IT to improve readiness and response. In other words, the test will measure how well you connect risk with infrastructure. You'll be asked to bridge security and operations with strategy, performance, and governance. In other words, your answers must show technical understanding in a business context. Domain 4 is broad, but its scope is highly practical. In other words, it focuses on real systems, not abstract frameworks. It covers IT architecture, infrastructure, and how they align with enterprise risk strategy. In other words, the physical and logical layout must reflect risk needs. You'll need to understand change and configuration management and how unmanaged change introduces risk. In other words, change without control increases uncertainty. Incident and problem management are also key. Tracking the life cycle of failure and ensuring responses are timely and traceable. In other words, failures must be managed and resolved visibly. Disaster recovery and business continuity are major focus areas in this domain. In other words, keep the business running even when systems break. You'll also see coverage of security frameworks, data protection requirements, and the secure system development lifecycle. In other words, Domain 4 combines technology, compliance, and lifecycle control. Emerging technologies such as AI, cloud, and automation are also within scope, especially when tied to risk and control gaps. In other words, innovation brings new risk that must be evaluated and governed. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. The primary goal of Domain 4 is to ensure that IT systems and services operate within the organization's defined risk tolerance. In other words, tech must support business comfort with risk. This means designing infrastructure, processes, and support functions that anticipate failure and provide built-in controls. In other words, prepare systems for interruption and attack. Risk professionals in this domain must work closely with project teams, architects, and IT leaders to make sure that risk is managed during design, implementation, and maintenance. In other words, risk must be part of the IT lifecycle. Resilience, continuity, and recovery are emphasized, not just technical success. In other words, success is measured in outcomes, not uptime. Security awareness, privacy, and regulatory alignment are also critical. In other words, systems must protect sensitive data and follow the law. This domain treats IT not just as a tool, but as both a source of risk and a vehicle for control. In other words, IT is both the problem and the solution. CRISC emphasizes that security must be embedded, not added later. In other words, security should be designed in, not bolted on. That means controls should be part of the IT process, infrastructure, and system logic from the start. In other words, security is a design consideration. You must understand confidentiality, integrity, and availability, known as the CIA triad, and how to apply it through policy, technology, and behavior. In other words, protect data from exposure, loss, and disruption. Access control, authentication, and data lifecycle governance are part of this integration. In other words, know who gets what, when, and why. Security supports mitigation, compliance, trust, and business stability. In other words, secure systems protect value and reputation. On the exam, scenarios that show late or missing security often result in controls that are bypassed, ignored, or ineffective. In other words, delay equals vulnerability. Change and asset management are key control points for managing operational risk. In other words, what you change and what you own must be tracked. Unplanned or undocumented change is a leading cause of failure, exposure, and downtime. In other words, what you don't record can cause damage. Configuration management ensures that what is deployed matches what is documented and approved. In other words, records reflect reality. Asset management tracks what's in use, what's supported, and what needs attention. In other words, visibility equals control. Without asset visibility, it's impossible to monitor risk or respond effectively. In other words, blind spots lead to exposure. In Domain 4, you're expected to connect the dots between change, inventory, and security posture. In other words, you must show how operational detail supports risk reduction. Disaster recovery and business continuity are forward-looking disciplines. In other words, they plan for resilience before the crisis. They are designed to keep the organization running during crisis, not just recover afterward. In other words, survival matters more than restart. Key concepts include business impact analysis, recovery time objective, recovery point objective, and documented escalation paths. In other words, know what's most critical, how fast to bring it back, and who must act. Testing and rehearsing recovery plans is part of this domain. In other words, don't wait to find out what doesn't work. CRISC professionals are expected to evaluate whether recovery plans are realistic, aligned to risk tolerance, and properly resourced. In other words, make sure the plan works before it's needed. On the exam, expect questions about DR planning frequency, test coverage, and coordination between IT, business units, and governance. In other words, look for integration and follow-through. Risk management must be built into system development and project delivery. In other words, risk professionals must be part of the team, not just the audit. This means conducting assessments, reviewing architecture, and validating controls at every stage. In other words, review and approve continuously. Secure SDLC includes sign-offs, testing, change control, and governance oversight during development and deployment. In other words, controls should be layered into every phase. Agile and DevOps environments increase delivery speed, but also require clear control checkpoints. In other words, fast does not mean unchecked. CRISC scenarios often present situations where project risk was overlooked, or where delivery was rushed without validation. In other words, failure is seeded by omission. The best answers show integration of risk and security at each milestone. In other words, governance in every sprint. Emerging technology introduces new risk vectors, especially when governance doesn't keep up. In other words, the future brings risk you haven't seen yet. Cloud computing, automation, third-party APIs, AI, and IoT all change how data is processed, accessed, and protected. In other words, every innovation changes the threat model. Domain 4 expects you to evaluate whether due diligence was performed, whether architecture supports policy, and whether controls exist. In other words, you must test the foundation. The right approach is proactive. Risk professionals should influence adoption, not just react after implementation. In other words, guide the future before it becomes a problem. On the exam, scenarios may describe a new platform or tool that was deployed without risk review. In other words, watch for innovation without governance. Expect to assess missing controls, policy gaps, or stakeholder misalignment. In other words, you must spot the missing structure. Technology doesn't protect the organization by itself. People must participate. In other words, human behavior shapes system effectiveness. Security training, phishing simulations, access reviews, and incident drills all build awareness. In other words, reinforce security through behavior. Domain 4 links human behavior to IT performance. In other words, how people act determines how safe systems are. Risk professionals must build a culture where control expectations are understood and followed. In other words, awareness leads to accountability. On the exam, answers that emphasize user engagement and cultural alignment are often better than answers that only mention software or firewalls. In other words, don't forget the human layer. Your Domain 4 exam mindset should be integration-oriented. In other words, think across boundaries, think like a risk advisor to IT. Identify where your voice changes an outcome. In other words, look for points of intervention. Expect scenarios where technology design affects recovery, compliance, or resilience. In other words, systems impact governance. Be ready to justify risk sign-off, flag gaps in development, or recommend control layers. In other words, apply risk thinking throughout the life cycle. The best answers connect systems to business needs and technical design to organizational protection. In other words, solutions must serve both architecture and appetite. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal Cyber CRISC Risk Prepcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com.